Swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Most of the time in any kind of academic research paper that you're doing, you're going to be focusing mostly on using journal articles. Usually these will be in an academic setting from scholarly journals. That is to say, journals that are written by scholars for other scholars, but sometimes it's also using professional journals. And so very often I'll have students who have never heard of the professional or scholarly journals in their field because they haven't gotten deep enough into it. By the time they're juniors and seniors, usually they will have gotten far enough into it. And they'll sometimes say, well, there aren't any professional or scholarly journals in my field. So true story. Back when I was a student in the 1980s, I worked my way through school partially in the summers, working at a convenience store. And I liked to work the third shift, that is the night shift. And I liked to work that shift because I get paid a little bit more money. I think it was 25 cents an hour more, which wasn't great money more, but something more to me. And also it gave me a little bit of time to read. And one of the things that there was to read was the work, a journal would come in. And this was a print journal, and I think it was called C-Store Magazine. And this was a professional professional journal for convenience store managers. Actually today I went to see if C-Store was still around because I thought, I don't know if that's still around. I mean, it's been a long time since that was around. And I looked and I saw there's CS News, there's CSP, which is Convenience Store News and Petroleum. There is something called Convenience Store Decisions. Anyway, there are all sorts of Mr. Checkout, which I think is actually Distributors News. There are other sorts of, there are all sorts of these different professional magazines and professional journals just for people involved with convenience stores. And so my answer to anyone out there who says, well, are there any professional or scholarly journals in my field is if convenience store managers have many choices, then your field probably has them. And if you have a college degree or you're getting a college degree, that means that there are entire parts of the university, entire departments that are based around researching in your field, whatever that field would be, no matter how pragmatic you think it is. There are always important things for experts to say to one another. And normally we communicate these things in journals. And as I've described in other places, one big difference between books and journals is that books tend to contain information that's a lot more kind of settled knowledge, but they also take a long time to get into print. For it to take once a book is written, from the time it is written until it appears in print, 2 years would be pretty fast. You're really looking at from the time a book starts being written to when it comes out, probably realistically, 5 years. And so, when you're seeing, after some big event happens in the news and then 2 months later there are all these books about it, those are garbage books. I mean, those are books that no real authority would spend a lot of time looking at or thinking about. It takes a long time to really develop the sort of information that's worth having in a professional or scholarly book. Websites, on the other hand, take no time. Boom, we can put them up right away. I remember a few years ago there was this essentially this hoard of gold parts from weapons that had been found in England. Staffordshire hoard is what it was called, but that doesn't matter. And we were super excited. It was the biggest medieval archaeological find ever. And so what the scholars who were there were doing was literally, as they were cataloging the things, they would catalog them. They'd take the pictures for cataloging these, I think it was like 10,000 or so objects. I'm forgetting exactly how many now. They would immediately upload it to the internet so all the rest of us could see, which, by the way, as a medieval scholar, I was very appreciative of that. But basically all they're doing is telling us their first description of it, and here's a picture of it, and that was it. We're seeing it maybe 1 minute after or less after they've taken the picture. Nothing is well considered. Nothing is well studied. And that wasn't their point, right? Their point was to get the information out there. And those are really valid scholars, but they wouldn't say that what they posted, those pictures and that brief description, was the end all and be all of that thing. It takes a lot of research on something to really look at the ins and outs of it. And so journals occupy that middle space. And so they are things which have some kind of peer review of editors who are professionals in the field, review of other scholars, depending whether it's a professional or scholarly journal. But they try to get out pretty regularly. An annual comes out once a year, and that's pretty, that's actually pretty fast compared to a book. More likely, most books, more likely they're quarterly or every 3 months or twice a year. You won't usually see scholarly journals as soon as every month. That would be a little unusual because it's just really hard to do real due diligence on an entire magazine worth of stuff once a year, which, by the way, if you think, again, why is it that this popular magazine that comes out every week isn't considered a scholarly source when real scholarly sources won't come out once a month? That once a week is a kind of impossible timeline to really do your due diligence on something. Okay, so this is what's valuable about journal articles is they're fast, not as fast as websites, but they're pretty reliable, though not as reliable as books. They occupy that middle ground, and so they tend to actually be really the bulk of your sources. So how do I know a good journal article from a bad one? Unfortunately, this is getting even harder than it ever has been before. Now, once you are an expert, you're a professional in your field, or you're professional in your field, or you've become an expert or a scholar in your own right. You know what's important, what the important works are, because all the experts know what they are. However, when you're first starting, it's very hard to know. And in fact, the worst thing you can do is rely on names of journals and names. The more high sounding the name, ironically, it strikes me that the more high sounding the name, the less likely it is to be a great source. So nowadays, really over the last 5 years, maybe 10, we're starting to see the rise of what we'll call what we've called predatory publishers. And it sounds strange, but there is a market out there of people who essentially trick scholars, usually junior scholars, into saying, hey, we want to publish your work. And they get them to send it in, and then they publish it really quickly, though under what would be considered academically not legitimate circumstances. And the end result is that the work of that scholar was in some way wasted. So to give you an example, we were dealing with a situation one time where a colleague, not in my department, but a colleague had been invited by a journal they didn't know a lot about, but they knew some people on the editorial board, had been invited to send something in for publication. And they were flattered. And so they sent this article in for review. And literally a few days later, it was published, which, if you heard what I said before about it taking, a month to produce a scholarly journal is incredibly fast. A few days, not possible. It takes a long time to get peer reviews done. It takes a long time to do, checking on things and due diligence is simply not possible. And the person thought, well, what is going on here? And they started checking and discovered that this was not really a real scholarly journal. They would troll through different proceedings from academic events, and then they would find titles and they would email people and say, hey, we heard great things about the article, the presentation you gave on XYZ. Would you please send it to us? We'd be interested in considering it. And then they just immediately put it up for publication. And of course, charging anyone, who would want to see it after the fact. Well, this scholar was pretty upset to realize that their work, they'd been sort of tricked out of their work by this predatory publisher. So they contacted the person whose name they knew on the editorial board, and that person had never heard of this place before. And so that person, who was supposedly on the editorial board, contacted them and said, hey, what gives? Why is my name on your editorial board? And they sent back so sorry, it was just a mistake, and they took them off. And so the end result is that there are these predatory publishers out there who are basically making money by tricking junior scholars into sending their stuff in and publishing it without review, and thus in ways that are hard to get real academic credit for. So how do you know if it's one of those? Well, again, if you're not an expert, it's hard to tell. And like I said, sometimes the more highfalutin the name, the more likely they are to be. So take, for example, I will get probably once or twice a week, I'll get an invitation from some International Journal of Humanities and All Things Smart, some very high sounding name. And it turns out that that's a kind of predatory publisher. Whereas a real legitimate source, like say the Old English Newsletter. The Old English Newsletter is maybe the most important scholarly source for scholars who do Old English language and literature. Someone out there is on the editorial board of another one, arguably the most important one. Okay. But the name Old English Newsletter, it sounds like some, piece of garbage that 11-year-olds are printing out and stapling off and in their basement. But it really is a legitimate journal. It doesn't have a high-sounding name, but it really is. And so can you go by, well, what's the dumbest sounding name? Well, of course not. The most high-sounding name isn't always illegitimate, and the sort of most simple sounding name isn't always legitimate. But I just use those to give you an example of going by the name isn't the way to do it. And instead what you want to do is, in fact, look and see where other sources are being cited. So what do I mean by this? Well, elsewhere I've said, hey, look, if you're looking for good journals, or when you're looking for good journal articles, what you do is you go through the works cited pages in bibliographies of other books and journal articles, and see who they're citing and go read those articles. Well, the same is true for the journals. Look for where so many of these journal articles are coming from that are cited in bibliographies of works cited pages, bibliographies and works cited pages of books and of other journal articles and of websites. You'll see the same 20 journals coming up over and over again, and those journals are probably the ones which are the most well established. And so when you're trying to figure out not a specific article, but hey, what kind of journals would be good journals to look at those. If you find a journal article that really seems to fit, but it's a journal you've never heard of, and you start to look around and you think and you see what else is in there, does the rest of what's in there seem legitimate? Again, that's hard to tell when you're first beginning as an expert. When you're a student, you're just learning how to be a little expert in this. But eventually you'll come to understand it. Now, of course, most of the time you don't have to worry about the big issue about whether this is an important journal or not. You can just simply see if the article itself has been influential, but eventually you're going to want to learn what is a good journal, what is not a good journal. But that being said, from beginning to end, when you look at this, like all sources, journals have to be considered in this sort of complicated constellation of different kinds of sources. They're going to be the ones you use the most, but that doesn't mean that you turn off your brain and just use the first journal article that comes up when you do your search.